So this is the Polar Grit X2 Pro, and this is Polar's newest flagship outdoor-focused sports watch, and this is a pretty important watch for Polar with features like offline topo maps, a dual-frequency satellite chipset, as well as an AMOLED display. It basically takes everything from their other important watch, the Vanish V3, and makes a super rugged and extra durable version. Now, along with all the hardware changes, they've also introduced some pretty important software updates like a massively overhauled heart rate algorithm, which promises a lot, as well as some new navigation features, and I'll be going over all of those in this video, with of course a super deep dive into GPS accuracy as well as heart rate accuracy. And if you do happen to find the information in this video useful, do me a favor and just quickly hit that like button down below. It's a small thing that you can do that'll help this video and the channel quite a bit, and I appreciate it. Oh, and by the way, you may see a little bit of flicker in some of the shots in this video, but that's just due to the frame rate of my camera not matching the refresh rate on the watch. You don't see that in real life. Okay, so the Grit X2 Pro comes in two different versions. There's a stainless steel model as well as a titanium model. And with the stainless steel model, you'll get a silicone band. And with the titanium model, that comes with both a silicone band as well as a leather band. And I gotta tell you that I'm not really a leather watch band kind of guy, but this is seriously a very nice band. There's really nice stitching. It's great to the touch. I mean, it's just a great quality band and it looks awesome. Of course, you will want to use the silicone band during workout so you don't ruin the leather with sweat or anything like that, but you do have that option with the titanium version. And one other thing too with the different versions is that the bezel on the stainless steel model is a smooth bezel all around, where the titanium model has raised portions. When it comes to the size and weight, so the case measures up to be around 49.5 millimeters wide and a little over 14 millimeters thick, including the heart rate sensor. And this is how it looks on my 185 millimeter circumference wrist. And then when it comes to weight, so the stainless steel model weighs 57 grams for the case itself and 79 grams with the silicone band. The titanium version comes a little bit lighter at 47 grams for the case and 66.7 grams with the silicone band, and then 63.4 grams with the leather band. Now, when it comes to comfort and wearability, for being a larger watch in the whole scheme of things, I found it to be quite comfortable, and I think that has to do with the weight, where for a watch like this, it just feels lighter on the wrist than I would expect, which I think is nice. And then for durability, this really shouldn't be an issue either with these, with either the stainless steel or the titanium version, where they have a metal bezel as well as a metal case. And they went with resin on the back, which is fine since that's not going to be exposed, plus that likely reduces the weight. And then it also has a 100-meter water resistance rating, and then to protect the actual display, it has a sapphire lens. And I've been using this Grit X2 Pro Titan for well over a month now for everything that I do, and it still looks great. And then for the display, the Grit X2 Pro has a super bright and super crispy 1.39-inch AMOLED display with 454 by 454 pixels. And there's just tons of colors, there's tons of contrast. It's seriously a really good display, and that's both indoors as well as outdoors. Now, this is going to be a departure from the memory and pixel display technology that they had on the original Grit X Pro. Now, what's interesting here, though, is that in general, when comparing these two different kinds of display technologies, MIP uses less power than AMOLED, but funny enough, the Grit X2 Pro actually is advertised to get longer battery life in most scenarios, and that mainly has to do with a larger battery inside. And more details on battery life here in just one second. And then to get around the device, it uses a combination of 5 physical buttons along with a touchscreen. So you kind of have a choice of using the touchscreen when you want to and using the buttons in other situations where using a touchscreen isn't as ideal, like if your hands are sweaty or if you have gloves on. And the touchscreen responsiveness is also pretty good here, where swipes and taps are all predictable. And the best thing about having that touchscreen, though, is going to be while using the offline maps, where you can pan around the map much easier than you can do with buttons. And then for the responsiveness of the device, it's pretty snappy here as well, where there's really not much delay at all when going through all the widgets and menus, and then viewing data within widgets is also pretty quick. It's a nice, smooth experience. One thing with the interface, though, is that I'm feeling like it's a little bit dated at this point. Now, this is from the perspective of someone who tests dozens of watches every year from lots of different companies, so I get to try out lots of different kinds of interfaces, but this is basically the same interface that Polar's had for many years, and I just like to see a little bit of a refresh here to make it feel a little bit more modern. And when it comes to battery life, so the Grit X2 Pro can get anywhere from 5 days all the way up to 29 days of battery life just using it as a watch. And the reason for this big range are two main factors: using the always on display or not, as well as the heart rate sensor. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that most of you out there are going to use the heart rate sensor, so let's ignore that 29-day figure. Anyhow, while using the heart rate sensor, that's anywhere from like 5 to 10 days, and I'm super happy to report that the Grit X2 Pro is holding up very well to those claims, where I've been using the always on display, recording plenty of outdoor activities, and it's been going over that 5-day mark very consistently, like 6 to 7 days on most occasions. And then when it comes to battery life for recording outdoor activities, so on this right here, I was using the always on display. I had it in the highest accuracy settings. I was using wrist-based heart rate with no other sensors. And I started out at a full charge. And after a 2-hour and 20-minute ride, it had 89% remaining. So that comes out to about 4.7% per hour, or around 21 hours using the always on display. So that's very close to their 23-hour claim. Now, when it comes to smartwatch features, so you can receive notifications for texts, calls, and apps. There's also weather information that's synced from your phone, and you can also control the music playback from your phone as long as it's in range. But just note that the Grid X2 Pro, just like the Vantage V3, doesn't have any music storage or music playback capabilities. Now, when it comes to steps, well, I usually don't talk about steps in my videos unless I see something weird, and we're going to talk about steps in this video. So the Grid X2 Pro is quite sensitive when it comes to steps, even when you're not actually walking or running. And what I found is that it counts a crazy amount of steps when cycling, and this is both indoors and outdoors, where I could easily hit my step goal in just an hour of riding. And of course, I did mention this to Polar, and they basically just said that that's actually how it's designed, and provided a support article explaining that their devices will in fact register steps even for non-pedestrian activities. But personally, I don't really want steps to be counted when I'm biking, swimming, or basically whatever I'm doing that's not actually walking or running. But that's just me. When it comes to health features, so the Grid X2 Pro has Polar's 4th generation heart rate sensor that can track your heart rate 24 hours a day. It has an SpO2 sensor for tracking blood oxygen saturation levels. It also has a skin temperature sensor, and it also does have a wrist ECG. But just note that this ECG feature does not detect AFib, so this is going to be different than the medically approved ECG features that you get on the likes of an Apple Watch or some Garmin watches. Moving on to some training feedback. So the Grid X2 Pro provides stuff like your cardio load per activity, a training benefit in regards to the kind of systems that a particular workout is benefiting. There's VO2 max for running, as well as running power from the wrist without the need for an accessory. From a bigger picture standpoint though, there's also their cardio load status feature, which looks at your longer term training trends to provide feedback on how your training is impacting your fitness. So like here, it shows my strain on the left, which is my average daily training load over the last 7 days, and how that compares to my tolerance on the right, which is my average daily load from the last 28 days. So how you would actually use this is, let's say you're trying to increase your training volume. You can use this to make sure that you're not increasing your recent training volume too much from the last week compared to your more historical training volume over the last month. And this can work the other way around too, where if you're trying to taper, you can use this to make sure that you're decreasing training volume at your desired pace. When it comes to sleep tracking and recovery tracking, I find Polar's sleep tracking to be pretty good, where the Grid X2 Pro does a pretty decent job at tracking the time I went to bed, time I woke up, as well as tracking the time I spend awake during the night. And I also find the sleep score to correlate pretty well with how I actually feel in the morning. The Grid X2 Pro also comes with a pretty interesting feature called Boost. So this tries to reflect how your recent sleep can lead to energy levels and alertness throughout the day, and it's even trying to predict those levels to the hour. And it basically takes into account the amount and quality of your recent sleep, as well as your sleep rhythm or sleep schedule, and how it actually aligns with your body's actual circadian rhythm. Now, for how accurate it is or how useful it is, well, I found that sleep duration does seem to have the biggest impact on the Boost score. Like here, I'm at a 9.2 and I got 7.5 hours of sleep, and then got a sleep score of 81. But then here on this morning, I had a much higher Boost score with a lot more sleep, but my sleep quality was much less ideal. And that's where I'm not entirely sure how to use that feature, because for me, I tend to feel more energized after a good quality sleep versus a long sleep that may have been poor quality. There was also some recent talk, by the way, of sleep tracking working not quite right on a recent firmware update with the Vantage V3, and I seem to have kind of lucked out where I've had sleep data all but on one night, but I think they are aware of that bug and may be addressed in a future update. The Grid X2 Pro also has skin temperature tracking during sleep, so this feature is able to track trends in your skin temperature, so this could be useful in detecting changes in your body like a fever or illness, but it also could be useful for an additional metric when it comes to assessing your sleep quality. Like if you haven't been sleeping well recently, but your skin temperature is higher than normal, that could mean that maybe you're sleeping in too hot of a room. When it comes to sport profiles, the Grid X2 Pro basically has any sport profile that you can think of for a flagship multi-sport watch, with everything from running, cycling, swimming, both indoors and outdoors. There's multi-sport and triathlon modes. There's outdoor recreation profiles, plenty of gym profiles, basically lots of stuff to choose from. When it comes to recording outdoor activities, the Grid X2 Pro has a dual frequency or dual band satellite chipset, where it can not only access different satellite systems, but also multiple satellite frequencies at one time. So what this does is that it can help in accuracy in challenging environments where you may not have a clear view of the sky, where satellite signals can actually bounce off of objects like tall buildings, tall canyon walls, as well as heavy tree cover. Now, just because a watch has a dual frequency satellite chipset, it doesn't automatically mean that it's going to be more accurate. There's other factors involved like the antenna design that can play a factor in accuracy, and the Grit X2 Pro does have a different antenna design than the Bandage V3, mainly because it has a different case with different materials, which requires a new design. But when it comes to accuracy, so starting out with a Rode right here, overall pretty close to the other devices, but just a hair short. So if we take a look at the GPS tracks, from a high level, everything looks pretty good, but we kind of have to zoom in a little bit to see some of the detail. So in nearly the entire ride, these are some nice solid tracks from the Grit X2 Pro. All the straight line sections are nice and solid with no wavering going on or anything like that, and nearly all the corners were also solid as well, but I did notice on just a handful of corners, it cut in on just a few of those a little bit short, which could explain that minor difference in the total distance. For mountain biking, this starts to get a little bit more challenging with a lot of heavy tree cover as well as a lot of switchbacks, and here's where it was a hair short again compared to the other devices. The elevation gain also was just a little bit short, but still within the ballpark, so that's totally fine. For the finer detail of the GPS tracks, well, these are overall some very decent tracks out of the Grit X2 Pro. I really only noticed on this corner down here with some switchbacks, it kind of overcut just a hair. Moving on to some running, so here's a trail run that I did, and we're looking at pretty comparable distances here. I'd also note that the elevation gain using its built-in altimeter was also very much in line with the other devices, as well as the corrected elevation figure in Strava. Now, this run was done on a pretty challenging trail for GPS, where there's a lot of heavy tree cover, as well as a lot of tall rocks that could interfere with satellite signals. And although the total distance was close, the GPS tracks weren't quite as solid as I would have hoped, where there were just a few occasions where it wandered off the trail a little bit. There were never any huge misses by the Grit X2 Pro, and it was a decent performer, but maybe not quite as accurate as some other devices with the same kind of technology. When it comes to navigation features, the Grit X2 Pro has offline topo maps just like the Bandage V3, and these can help provide a lot of context to your location for outdoor activities, with images of roads, trails, bodies of water, as well as contour lines which can help illustrate elevation changes in your surroundings. The maps are also pretty responsive too, where you can pan and zoom around the map pretty quickly without much of a delay when it comes to redrawing the map. Oh, and it has 32 gigabytes of storage for those maps, by the way. And there's two different levels of detail for the maps, where the basic maps that are preloaded on the watch have roads, trails, and bodies of water. But the more detailed maps that you download from Polar's website have additional details like contour lines and some additional labels of some points of interest like bodies of water. And all the maps are free, by the way. Another nice thing to come with the Grit X2 Pro, which did also get updated with the Bandage V3, is that they're now giving you a historical breadcrumb trail of the path that you've taken during your outdoor activity, regardless of whether you load in a route or not. This was something that honestly they should have had all along, but hey, it's there now, which is nice to see. When it comes to actual navigation with a route file, so along with Komoot, which they've had for years, there's also now Strava route synchronization. Now, this isn't a new feature for the Grit X2 Pro per se, but rather every route-capable Polar watch, which is pretty darn cool. There is a little bit of a difference though when it comes to routes from Komoot versus routes from Strava. So routes from Komoot have turn-by-turn instructions. So when you approach a turn, an alert will pop up indicating how much distance there is until the next turn with an audible warning. With Strava, you get the route information, but there aren't those turn indicators built in. And that's apparently something that Komoot is able to build in with their integration with Polar, but it's currently not there with Strava. But other than Komoot or Strava, you can also load in your own GPX file from your favorite route creation tool. With all types of routes though, something else new that they introduced, and again not just exclusive to the Grit X2 Pro, is that there's now directional arrows for which direction you should go when you have a route loaded up. Okay, so now let's finally get into heart rate accuracy, and this is pretty interesting. So the Grit X2 Pro has their latest and greatest 4th generation heart rate sensor that they introduced with the Bandage V3. However, the heart rate accuracy on the Bandage V3 simply wasn't all that great. But what they did though is that they did a massive overhaul to the heart rate algorithm that they use in conjunction with the sensor, which is supposed to be a lot more accurate, especially during interval type scenarios where it's supposed to correct inaccurate data on the fly, on the watch itself, when it detects something may not be right. So it's kind of like machine learning or an AI kind of thing, where with stuff like intervals, there's a certain trend that generally happens where you do work for a certain amount of time and then usually take a rest and then rinse and repeat. So what this new algorithm is supposed to do is detect if something kind of went wrong during one of those sets and make a correction based on predicted trends. And they apparently added something like 20,000 lines of code or something like that for this new algorithm. So let's see if that actually worked to improve accuracy. Okay, so starting out with some indoor cycling. So here's a steady state ride, and that's pretty darn solid. A few little momentary spikes at the beginning, and a couple spots where wandered off for a second, but all in all, a pretty good job out of the Grit X2 Pro. And then here's another ride, and I'm pretty darn happy with this one as well. Again, a handful of little mini spikes where I was off for a moment or two, but all in all, I think it did a good job. And then moving on to some intervals, again, a few of those little blips, but this is pretty good. We're responding pretty well to the quick changes in heart rate. Oh, and then I was also testing the Vantage V3 on my other wrist with the new firmware, which other than a few spikes was basically in line. Now taking it outside for some road riding, and this ride actually had a good amount of gravel as well. Not bad, but not quite as accurate as the indoor examples, and that is to be expected since when you're riding outside, there's a few more variables to deal with like vibrations and bumps of the road, as well as some gravel on this ride, which can make the watch kind of bounce around, which can lead to inaccurate results. And from a high level, it's not bad and matched fairly closely. It did have a few spikes right here, but it did recover quickly from those spikes. Now, when it comes to mountain biking, I found this to be a very challenging activity for any wrist-based optical heart rate sensor due to a lot of the gripping onto the handlebars, which tenses your wrist, along with a lot of the rough terrain, which can make a watch bounce around. And heavier watches tend to do worse here just because of the increased weight. But for mountain biking, this is actually a pretty good result. It won't be quite as accurate as road riding since there's going to be more variables to deal with, but overall, this is pretty good data. So on the first third of the ride, so this was on the road on the way to the trailhead, and it was pretty good other than this little high reading for a few minutes right here. Now, as I ascended on the actual trail, it was tracking pretty well with a few little blips here or there. But right here, this is where I started to descend, and this is where you can see some crazy data out of all wrist-based optical heart rate sensors, and that's where the Grit X2 Pro did start to wander. But just for some perspective, this is what can happen out of a lot of sensors when going downhill on a watch. So this is actually not bad from the Grit X2 Pro and seemed to recover fairly well. And then at the end here, when I was riding back on the road, it tracked extremely well. For running, so here's a mix of a steady state warm-up along with some intervals at the end, and that's quite good. It went a tiny bit over and a tiny bit under right here, but for the first 20 minutes, that's basically what I like to see. And then for the actual intervals, that's pretty respectable. So it tracked a little high on this one right here and a little high on this last one at the end, but that's pretty great overall. Now, moving on to some trail running, here's where the Grit X2 Pro wasn't quite as good as on that last run. It was never like way far off, but it was just kind of weaving in and out for a bit for most of the time. But here's another trail run I did where it struggled quite a bit more on both ascending as well as descending. This was a very steep trail though, both up and down, so it could have had something to do with the weight of the watch where it may have been bouncing around a little bit more than that previous run, which wasn't as steep. When it comes to weight training, so this is basically the holy grail when it comes to wrist-based optical heart rate sensors, mainly due to the location of the sensor, where it can get affected by things that happen during weight training, like gripping onto dumbbells, as well as a lot of varying arm movement, which these kinds of sensors don't like. So in this session here, this is actually not bad, where for the most part, the Grit X2 Pro tracked nearly everything well. We see on these shoulder flies right here that it missed a couple, and then a little over and under on a couple of these kettlebell swings at the end, but for weight training, this is still pretty usable. In fact, it was even outperforming the Polar OH1 Plus arm-based optical heart rate sensor I was wearing on those kettlebell swings, where you see a little bit of a delay, which can happen with optical heart rate monitors when it comes to arm-based movement like this. And then on this session here, again, not terrible when it comes to weight training and high-intensity interval training. A little high when it started out right here, kind of a mess actually right here on these bicep curls from both the arm-based optical heart rate sensor as well as the Grit X2 Pro. It read a bit high on the first few sets of kettlebell swings, but after that, it did a really good job and a very good job of the running intervals at the end. All in all though, not the most precise that I've seen for weight training, but no huge misses either. Again though, with that kind of activity, it's just challenging in general for a watch to track accurately, so using an external heart rate strap will be your best bet for the most accurate results. Now, when it comes to their new heart rate algorithm, which is supposed to automatically correct inaccurate heart rate data, I tested the crap out of this. And how I tested this, by the way, was dual recording the heart rate from the Grit X2 Pro. So I was recording on the watch itself, of course, but I was also broadcasting the live heart rate on the watch to another device. So in theory, we should see the raw data coming off of the watch without any corrections on the partner device. And if we compare that to the saved activity data from the Grit X2 Pro, if it detected anything strange, we should see that correction. So again, I tested this over and over and over again, and I didn't see any corrections for all my activities. And I was just about to call it a day and say that it was kind of like the Loch Ness Monster. Rumored that it was there, but no one really saw it. But just last night, it actually happened, and I finally was able to witness that correction on this set right here of kettlebell swings, and it did properly predict the correct heart rate trend. For the rest of the sets though, nothing unfortunately happened, and I was very deliberate in making sure that my arms were at rest for at least 45 seconds or more, and that's something that Polar mentioned that is pretty important to get this correction. So does it actually happen? Well, I can confirm that it does, but for how often and how well it works, I'm not quite sure on that front. So with all that, what do I really think of the Grit X2 X2 Pro? Well, first off, I have to give them a lot of credit for putting a lot of work into their new heart rate algorithm, which seems to be paying off for my tests. I wish I got to witness a few more of those heart rate correction bits, but the overall accuracy of the heart rate sensor is much better than the original firmware that I tested, so good stuff there. Feature-wise, it has pretty much everything that you'd expect from a premium outdoor-focused sports watch, with high-end materials like stainless steel or titanium, the dual-frequency satellite chipset, the offline maps, lots of training and recovery feedback. It's pretty much in line with most of its competitors in regards to features. But that brings us to price. So Polar's asking a premium price for this watch, but I think it needs to be a little bit cheaper based on some other watches on the market. So dropping the price to, let's say, like $649 and $749 respectively for the stainless steel and the titanium models makes it a lot more competitive considering what else is out there, like the Suunto Vertical, the Coros Vertix 2, and the Epix Gen 2. Now, compared to the Suunto Race though, well, I mean, it can't really hold a candle to that price, but Suunto is kind of going for blood with the pricing strategy on that watch. But I do have to say that Polar is definitely back in the game when it comes to outdoor-focused sports watches with both the Grit X2 Pro as well as the Vantage V3, especially with this new software. But I think they do need to get into more people's hands, and a slightly lower price tag can certainly help with that. Anyhow, those are just my thoughts on the Grit X2 Pro, but I definitely want to hear from you as well. So definitely let us all know what you think down in the comments section down below. And on your way down there, do me a favor and just hit that like button if you found the information in this video useful. In the meantime, have fun out there, and we will see you in the next video.